Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on natural disasters and climate change in the Middle East and North Africa, organized by the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. My name is Yasmina Abu Zuhur. I'm a research scholar with Princeton University and a non-resident fellow with the Council. Today, I have the honor of being your moderator for this timely discussion, and I look forward to receiving your questions to our speakers using the Q&A feature on this Zoom. Before we proceed, I have a message to our Arabic-speaking audience. مرحبا بكم في هذه الندوة حول الكوارث الطبيعية وتغير المناخ في منطقة الشرق الأوسط وشمال إفريقيا. أخبر المتابعين الكرام بأن الترجمة الفورية بالعربية متوفرة. Let's start. Catastrophic floods hit parts of Morocco and Algeria last week, coinciding with the one-year anniversary of the now infamous earthquake that devastated Morocco. 2023 saw other major natural disasters, including destructive floods in Libya, and a magnitude 7.8 earthquake in Derna, in Turkey and Syria. Taken together, these events have killed and displaced hundreds of thousands of people. They have caused hundreds of billions of dollars in damages, and to this day, local communities are still struggling to recover from them. There is no debate. Natural disasters are multiplying across the Middle East and North Africa, and they are leaving behind immense loss, devastation, and destruction. In their wake, people have raised important questions. Why are earthquakes and floods happening so often? How do they impact these countries' societies, and how will they transform the landscape of our region? Most importantly, what can we do? What can our leaders do to help local communities better prepare for the next time? We are joined today by three distinguished speakers who will answer these and other questions and who will help us grapple with this new reality facing our region. Salma Ashami is the Director of Research at the Arab Barometer, a public opinion research center housed at Princeton University. The Arab Barometer covers several important topics, including the topic of climate change. Ahmed Aysan is a professor of Islamic finance and associate dean for research at Hamad bin Khalifa University. He is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Middle East Council. Ahmed has recently published on sustainability, climate policy uncertainty, and earthquake preparedness. Malak Al-Taib is an independent researcher on climate change, water politics, and energy policy. She is a non-resident fellow with the Middle East Institute and a member of the World Youth Parliament for Water, as well as the Groundwater Youth Network. Malak is therefore uniquely qualified to start us off with our discussion of climate change. Malak, we often hear that natural disasters are linked to climate change. Can you help us understand this relationship better and how it plays out in the MENA region?
Thank you so much, Yasmina, for your question, and thank you so much for having me in this panel today. So first, to set the scene in order to understand the link between climate change and natural disasters in the MENA region, it's important to understand first how climate change, and as you mentioned in the introduction, acts as a risk multiplier or a threat multiplier for natural disasters. So what we're seeing now, and as you mentioned, certain statistics from natural disasters from last year, and we're seeing more frequent natural disasters this year. Globally, we're seeing more frequent and intense storms, for instance. We're seeing prolonged periods of droughts. We're seeing more flooding events and heat waves. And the connection lies in how climate change accelerates shifts in weather patterns. So what does this mean when we think about, for instance, heat waves, or when we think about floodings that, for instance, in the case of Storm Daniel? For example, warmer air holds more moisture. So when we have an air that a warmer air that has more moisture, it leads to heavier rainfall and flash floods. While when we see the case of rising sea temperatures, they have the intensity, or they have the capacity to supercharge tropical storms. And this is what happened in the case of Storm Daniel last year, is that now we're seeing an increase in sea temperature and also we have sea level rise. This increase in temperature is providing a charge for tropical storms to happen. And this is what happened in the Mediterranean, for instance. And this event is considered rare for the region, but given the fact that now we're having rising sea temperatures, we're seeing more tropical storms forming within the region. Also, for the MENA region, the effects of climate change are particularly acute due to the region's natural vulnerabilities. Already, it's considered one of the hottest and driest parts of the world. Of course, many countries within the region, they have the arid and semi-arid climate characteristics. So this gives an indication of how overall climate patterns look like, or the overall climate, let's say, under the normal scenario. But also for the MENA region, it faces a significant threat from rising temperatures. For instance, we have prolonged droughts for Tunisia. Last year, they had to impose a water quote by the government in order to reduce the usage of groundwater aquifers, given that they had 4 years of consecutive droughts. And also, we're seeing increasingly unreliable rainfall. So the region is highly dependent on scarce water resources, with many countries relying on non-renewable aquifers. And that's the case for many countries in the region. If we take the case for Libya, there's a huge dependence, over 90% on non-renewable groundwater aquifers. And there's the problem of over-extraction, which we're seeing not only in Libya, we're seeing in countries that have transboundary aquifer systems. So as temperatures rise, water scarcity becomes more severe, which is not only threatens agriculture and food security, but here we're talking about risks in terms of conflict over resources, and also over shared resources. So if we see the link, I mean, in brief, we can see that there is a direct link between the changes imposed by climate change and the emergence of natural disasters, which we are now seeing more frequent in the MENA region.
Thank you, Malak. Ahmed, Malak has explained to us how climate change impacts natural disasters and the heightened effect in the MENA region. I'd like to turn to how this topic is perceived in the region. And you recently created a tool to measure the uncertainty surrounding climate policies by analyzing the news media. What can you tell us about climate policy uncertainty in our region and its implications?
Thank you, Yasmina. We have been working on this climate uncertainty index for a while. Actually, let me start with our motivation. When we check the climate change related discussions, mostly it is about the policy discussions. What happened in COP28, what the countries are doing. Even I was in Singapore Economic Association meeting in the summer, and there was a Harvard professor discussing about the similar policy issues. And the policy issue was not just about COP28, even the discussions between the presidents of the countries are even more important than what is actually happening. But to our surprise, no one is looking at kind of the demand side of it, because we believe that the climate change related uncertainties are even more important for the economies. Because in policymaking, you can take some decisions, and this will take some time for the implementation. But currently, any sort of climate change related uncertainties will affect the investment decision, any economic decision. But to our surprise, no one has looked at this for the MENA region. So we thought that we can devise a methodology to look at the sentiments and then how the climate change uncertainty is affecting some other economic variables. And this uncertainty is quite important, by the way. I mean, it is becoming even more and more important globally. There are two types of uncertainty theoretically. One is the ex-ante uncertainty, which we have lots of ex-ante uncertainties about the climate change. Even people do not agree that there is a climate change, right? This is related with the beliefs, with the ideas. And even we believe in it, people do not agree about the actions. But this is more about the ex-ante, about the preferences and so on. The more important probably uncertainty is about the ex-post uncertainty, which is about the distribution of this cost of a climate transition. what I'm trying to say, there are lots of uncertainties associated with climate change, whether it is ex ante or ex post, whether it is related with the initial preferences or it's about the distribution of costs. So what we thought, and certainly, by the way, we know that these uncertainties are important for the economic decisions. And in the literature, we have lots of uncertainties, like inflation uncertainty, growth rate uncertainties. But the climate change uncertainty is also different, because when you have a inflation rate uncertainty, for example, as a policymaker, as a former central banker, I can say that you can do something about it. But for climate change uncertainty, you may not do much, because some of this uncertainty is not necessarily related with the local economy. It is related with the global economy. That's why, first of all, we believe that it is quite important to be able to measure these uncertainties. And that's why we wanted to come up with an uncertainty index. And our index is relying on some AI tools, and we are getting data from more than 15,000 different sources, newspapers, Twitter, social media, and so on. And we put certain keywords to measure this climate change uncertainty. And we have very interesting results, actually. I mean, we started from a more academic motivation by observing that nobody is discussing this, or there are some discussions in the literature, but the discussions have not reached the region. And we wanted to look at it for many countries. And then we calculated our climate change uncertainty index. Again, this is important for the economic decision. It is probably more important than what people have decided in COP28 or earlier, because this is something that it is affecting our daily life. It is affecting our investment decision, financial stability decisions. So we come up with our sentiment index, which is climate change uncertainty tracker index. We have very interesting results. Let me show you I will show you just only 3 figures very quickly. And it will, I believe, you will see how the results are quite interesting. So let me do this. Yes. For example, our climate change uncertainty index is, first of all, we are not just doing it for MENA countries. We get all the countries we have, and then we analyze. For example, this is the case from US. Many people will know the US anyway. For example, our climate change, climate policy uncertainty index increases when we have a Volkswagen emission scandal, or when we have the withdrawal of US from the Paris Accords, or when the US rejoin again, there is a climate change uncertainty index again signaling us there is something happening. So this is kind of a robustness of our climate change uncertainty index. But what is interesting, when we come to the country level, and then we categorize it in according to the region, we found something in contrary to our expectations. We were expecting that in developed countries, climate change related discussions will be more, and people will be discussing this even more, and then there will be more uncertainty. But to our surprise, Global South has much more uncertainty about the climate change. And for example, in here, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, MENA region, they are the highest in terms of climate change uncertainty tracker index. And we try to explain this later. I mean, probably these countries are not very much involved in the policy discussions, or even they are involved in the policy discussions, they are not in the powerful stage, or they cannot formulate their own policies. There could be all sorts of reasons, but in this issue, we want to just discuss the possible reasons. But by itself, this is quite explanatory, and this is kind of an interesting result for the academics, for the policymakers. There are lots of climate policy related uncertainties that the developing countries need to address, or developed countries should help to address this climate policy uncertainty, because this is affecting the economic decisions. This is affecting even the policymakers' involvement in these discussions. It is not just enough to host COP28, different COPs. It is also important to be able to say and to influence the policy making in this global discussions. And most likely global south, including the most of the MENA countries, are feeling left behind. And we see the same thing here. We also check this in the country by country. And like in Sudan, in many of the MENA countries, global uncertainties are much more than the developed countries. We believe this is, we have done some econometric analysis later on, but we believe this is quite an early signal how we should discuss the uncertainty, why this is important, and we shouldn't just discuss about what the policymakers need to do or what people have decided on COP28, but we should probably discuss about the economic consequences. And we believe that our climate change uncertainty tracker, we have the daily data on this, could be tracked by the policymakers, could be tracked by the academics, and it can be a guide for future policy formulations. And it could be also guide how the global south is somewhat integrated in the policy discussions, and it is also guide for the developed countries policymakers, because climate change is a global issue. Everybody needs to be involved, and apparently, according to our results, global south doesn't seem to be very much integrated into the discussions. That's why we have much more uncertainty surrounding on climate change in developing countries.
Thank you,
Thank
Ahmed.
you.
You've shown us that there's high climate policy uncertainty in our region, even though, as Malak explained, climate change is an important topic that has a huge effect. Selma, I'm curious to see if this is reflected in the public opinion data. What can you tell us about MENA citizens' attitudes towards climate change? Muted, Selma. You're muted.
Sorry about that. Thanks very much for having me, Yasmina. Let me start sharing my screen here so we can talk a little bit more about that in depth. Oh, this did not go. So just to start briefly, for those of you who don't know us, Arab Barometer is the longest standing nonprofit, nonpartisan research center based at Princeton University over 8 waves. We've done more than 125,000 personal interviews to date in 95 nationally representative surveys in 17 countries across the Middle East and North Africa. We have a tripart mission to track attitudes and behavior, to build institutional capacity in the region by working very closely with our partners, without whom kind of this data collection enterprise would not be possible. And then finally, as we are doing here, to disseminate knowledge about citizens living in MENA, to amplify their voices in public discourse about these issues that affect them. Our data is publicly accessible, and the reports are in both Arabic and English online. They are provided at no cost. Some of the data that I will be discussing today will be available later this month, and some of it actually already is available. The data I am discussing today comes from our latest wave, our 8th wave of surveys, which were conducted between September 2023 and July 2024. Just a few notes about some of the countries I'll be discussing. Our data in Palestine was concluded before October 6th. In Tunisia, half of our results before and half were after October 6th. And then importantly, in Morocco, the data was collected between December 2023 and January 2024. So about 3 months after the catastrophic earthquake there. Our surveys are nationally representative with sample sizes of 1,200 to 2,400. We talk to citizens 18 years of age and over at their place of residence. We've got varying response rates between 20 and 70%, and we've got a complex survey design stratified by government and urbanity to ensure that we're being nationally representative. So I'll start by giving a few thoughts on kind of a brief overview of MENA citizens' opinions. And, one of the things that Malak had talked about is very much reflected in our data. For the second year now, we have asked about what is the biggest environmental challenge facing the country. Overall, you do see a little bit of variability across these varied countries. Of course, the types of challenges that they're facing are a little different, but in general, what they conglomerate around is water-related challenges, specifically the pollution of drinking water, the pollution of waterways, and a lack of water resources. It's a little bit different in a place like Kuwait, where the main issue tends to be air quality. But kind of water issues really are the main things. Now, That is also to say that water, rather than climate change, is what is kind of most acute to people. So you see, for example, in Tunisia, Morocco, and Iraq, the three places where climate change are actually have the highest number of respondents saying it's the biggest environmental challenge. They are, it nonetheless pales in comparison to those that are saying water challenges are really most proximate. That said, the effects of environmental changes are very much felt. So when we ask to what extent people feel like extreme weather temperatures, air pollution, and water scarcity affect their day-to-day lives, the vast majority, that is overwhelming majorities above 63%, say that they are affected to a great or medium extent by each of these. In Iraq, these numbers are really huge. It's 4 out of 5 people, more than 4 out of 5 even, that are saying that extreme weather, air pollution, and water scarcity are a problem. Again, across the board, the highest percentages we see are with water scarcity. They also are affecting people's everyday lives in terms of the cuts to the electricity and water that they're experiencing. This is particularly the case in Iraq and Lebanon, where well over half the population experience cuts on a daily or a weekly basis. But one of the things that we wanted to do this way, and this speaks a little bit to what Ahmed had been saying, is to understand to what extent there is a shared understanding of what is climate change. Now, according to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, this is back in 1992, it's defined as a change in climate attributed directly or indirectly to human activity that alters the composition of the global atmosphere, and which is in addition to natural climate variability observed over comparable periods of time. So we asked, what comes to mind when you hear the word climate change? And there are pluralities that actually say, so plurality is the greatest number of people say that it is extreme weather. In Jordan and Palestine and Iraq, it's actually the majority that agree on that. But in other places, we do see a little bit more variability. I'll come back to this in a bit, but Morocco in particular, where, you say climate change and people think natural disasters. That said, while there is maybe a little bit more variability in understandings of climate change, there is nonetheless causal attribution to it. That is, people understand that and have concerns about the direct impact of climate change on things like their mental health, their physical health, and their personal safety. There is less direct causality currently attributed to livelihood, so the main source of income, that you could see, we can understand that a little bit in terms of the direct causality is probably affecting those who work in things like the agriculture sector. And eventually, as we talk about the move away from dependence on fossil fuels in our more, in our countries that are reliant on the oil industry, on coal, that will probably have more an effect as it comes in, but it's probably seen as indirect right now rather than a direct causal impact on that. But again, well over 50% of all respondents in all countries say that climate change has, they're concerned to a great or medium extent of the effect of climate change on their mental or their physical health. There is less, causal attribution to food scarcity, which is also something that, of course, climate change is affecting in the region. So not only non-renewable sources of water, which is going to affect agriculture production, but also, in the ability to grow food, increasingly arid, salination of water, et cetera, that is affecting kind of local production. And yet, climate change is not actually seen as the biggest cause of food-related problems and shortages. The highest percent, in fact, is in Morocco, where 16% say climate change is responsible. But in most other countries, the greatest share, and in fact, the majority in Iraq at 61% say it's government mismanagement. So there's a little less causal linkage there. And something that we've actually seen for more than 1 year now, this is actually the second year in which we have found this, is that on the one hand, super majorities really acknowledge that climate change poses a critical or important threat to kind of national security interests. So the lowest share here is 72 in Mauritania, up to, unsurprisingly, 90% in Morocco. That said, when we ask about climate change in the context of many other problems, corruption, the economic security, migration, it isn't actually seen as the most pressing problem. So in fact, only in Morocco do above 10%, so 14% say that climate change is the most important problem facing the country. When you ask specifically about natural disasters, that changes a little bit, right? There are, Morocco, Tunisia, Lebanon, unsurprisingly, in the year right before we went to the field for AB8. Of course, calamities happening between the forest fires and floods and earthquakes. So super majorities there saying they are very or somewhat concerned about the future of natural disasters. So in summary, there is an acknowledgement among citizens that climate change is not a distant or intellectual phenomenon, right? Majorities in all countries report that they're deeply affected by its consequences, and they specifically and causally link climate change to mental and physical health. But when we put in comparative perspective with other environmental challenges posed by climate change itself is a little less acute in citizens' eyes. And when we put it in comparative perspective with other national or regional challenges, climate change is certainly recognized as a threat, but it's not among the most pressing ones. And finally, there is some consensus around what we mean when we say climate change with respect to the extreme kind of changes in temperature and fluctuation in the atmosphere, but the attribution to human activity is still lacking. And that is a point I'll come back to a little later.
Thank you, Selma. So now we have an idea about how climate change impacts natural disasters, how it is perceived, and how it is dealt with in the region. Now I want to take a closer look at what happened after these natural disasters, like the earthquake in Morocco or the floods in Libya. And Malak, I'll start with you. What did these reconstruction efforts look like? How have they impacted local communities? What can you tell us more about this topic?
Yes, definitely. I mean, following the disasters that happened last year, and as I mentioned earlier, we're seeing recurrence of these disasters, and more frequency. There's an increased frequency for those year by year, and the intensity is increasing. But when we talk about reconstruction efforts, for instance, following natural disasters, indeed they're critical to restore the livelihoods. But of course, the level of destruction differs from one country to another based on the natural disaster. However, the degree to which these efforts are sustainable varies. So often we're seeing that there's shortcomings of the need to build back better, incorporating climate resilience into reconstruction plans. I think this is an element that we're still trying to not introduce, but trying to discover when we talk about reconstruction efforts. Do we have an element lens or an element variable to it? For instance, in Libya, the catastrophic floods caused by Storm Daniel in 2023, it was a stark reminder of the consequences of a lack of consistent or it's a consistent preparedness for climate-induced disasters. We've seen it in terms of the number of losses, number of deaths, and also the number of destruction that affected the city as a whole. If we look closely, the storm was exacerbated by weak infrastructure, especially the failure of the two dams in Derna, which had not been properly maintained for decades due to political instability and, of course, neglect. However, when we look at the reconstruction efforts, we've seen that after the storm, we've seen that, and whether it has been through the support of international entities or in Libya specifically, we've seen how, for instance, efforts have been put in order to restore at least the basic services. If I want to focus on the sector that I've been working on, which is water sector, we've seen that the total, according to reports, that the total losses and damage to water and sanitation infrastructure in Derna, they were the highest among the municipalities that were affected by Storm Daniel in northeastern Libya. Also, we've seen that in many reports, if we consider the water infrastructure in terms of desalination, I mean, the city had a desalination plan, and the capacity of the desalination plan fell from I think 40,000 cubic meters a day to around 10 to 16,000 cubic meters a day due to the storm damage. And this gives you an indication of how specific sectors are affected. But we're talking about an integral sector like water, for instance, and the level of impact it has left. So the reconstruction, I mean, governments in Libya, they have been trying to restore at least the basic water networks, pipelines, and so on in order to at least provide the necessity of water needed by the population within the city. However, there are many challenges when we talk about reconstruction in the case of Libya. So the reconstruction in Libya is already a complicated, given the country's fragile political landscape, and also it's marked by periods of conflict, weak governance, and also divided institutions. So this fragmentation makes it very difficult to coordinate large-scale recovery efforts. And the lack, of course, of a unified government, it has contributed to the ability to allocate resources evenly and also effectively in terms of implementing long-term rebuilding strategies and engaging international partners in order to ensure that the reconstruction work will be quite systematic and sustainable, and it has a long-term impact on the long run. However, in terms of I would say level, I mean, the reconstruction is ongoing, but of course, the impact of Libya's political situation has a huge contribution to how reconstruction looks like, and if it includes climate resilience factors in it. So for Libya's reconstruction efforts to have, as I highlighted, a long-lasting or long-term impact, it should be climate resilient. We need to address or think that reconstruction should have a climate resilient approach. Simply rebuilding what was destroyed without addressing underlying vulnerabilities, for instance, if we're talking about the inadequate infrastructure, poor urban planning, also the weak climate governance, it would still leave communities, for instance, in Darna or in the country as a whole, just as vulnerable to future disasters. So there's a need to rebuild infrastructure that can withstand extreme weather events and take climate resilient factors effectively in the reconstruction. So even though the reconstruction work have been happening for a few months now, but it's considered slow, and the focus is on restoring the basic services within the city. But overall, I mean, the city still needs a lot of work in terms of investment, international stakeholders involvement, and so on.
Thank you, Malak. As you were speaking, I was reminded of this brief that Ahmed wrote on earthquake preparedness in Turkey. Ahmed, I'm curious to look at a different subset of actors. What were central bankers doing at that point? What have they done since these natural disasters? And what can you tell us about how they can be more involved going forward in climate policy making?
Great. Thank you, Yasmina. It's quite interesting. Many of the topics that used to be considered to be very marginal, for example, for about 10, 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago, when somebody said that there will be a climate change department in the central banks, probably you will not believe in this because the issues were quite different at that time, the financial stability, growth, and so on. There are some usual mandates of the central banks, and they are mainly employment and price stability. But climate change is also quite affected by the central banks. And in recent years, we see more and more emphasis to climate change given by the central banks. Most of the central banks right now have climate change related departments, and they approach the issue from the financial stability perspective. And the COVID-19 period also quite instrumental there, because in the climate change, there are two things. One is, and the climate change and disaster. One is, what are you going to do as a central bank just after a disaster happens? And what sort of policy measures, monetary policy measures, financial stability measures, whether the banks will collapse, what will happen to the financial stability. This is pretty much doable because it is something that you can do just after, but before that you have to get ready for it. So there is kind of a future preparedness needed, even for the central bank policies. But this is something that we pretty much know. I mean, we can take some we can do some regulations, we can increase the liquidity of the banks and so on. But the most difficult thing is about how to handle the climate change for the central banks. Because in all the other things, you take the decisions and then the things are happening in the local economy. So you know the results of your actions. But for climate change, you will take the actions, but the benefits or the results will be observed by the rest of the world, or it may not be even observed by the rest of the world at all, because there are lots of measurement issues. But still, there is a new global governance formed. I mean, it is in the process, certainly, but there is a new climate change related governance being formed globally. And this is quite similar to the banking, because climate change policies require some global coordination. And the best global coordination that we observe actually is in finance. When you look at the BIS regulations, Basel I, Basel II, Basel III, or Financial Stability Board decisions after the 2008 crisis, we have a very good example that actually there is a possibility of global coordination and the countries will follow it, like BIS rules, the Basel I, Basel II. Same thing right now, also BIS is also involved, but there are some new global regulations started to be adopted by the central banks. And the question for us, people from the MENA region, or for policymakers from the MENA region, what can we do about this? Because we will take some policy actions. We will not necessarily see the results for our countries, but we will see it for the rest of the world. Which brings us to the international relations. I mean, central banking is also kind of an international relations, because you defend the rights of your country in negotiating with the other countries and with the international regulations. And there is a big scope and there's a big need for the MENA countries to organize and to bring the ideas from the global south, because one way or other, MENA countries are most likely to be affected by the climate change related regulations. Probably there will be some global tax and they will impose it at the origin. And then what will happen to the Gulf countries? Probably Gulf countries will pay it. And there are arguments like that. I mean, especially from the Western world, like anyway you are extracting the resources, you just pay it at the beginning, and then let's channel this money for climate mitigation strategies. But why is it starting from the beginning? Why is it not at the end, the conception? So these are all part of the international negotiations. And we are familiar with this, because even for the BIS related regulations, the central banks have lots of meetings, lots of committees, and they decide in the Financial Stability Board at the end probably. But it's a part of the global negotiations. And what we observe, many countries are not necessarily well developed in terms of formulating these policies, even though we host COP27, COP28, and so on. But it doesn't mean that in the policy making, the many countries are really there. We have to be at the table, and in order to be at the table, we need to really do our homework. We should do our research. We should collaborate with the other countries. We should collaborate with the other MENA countries, because the MENA countries are relatively similar. There has to be a common voice. And there is already kind of a global disparity in terms of power between the global south and global north. And this north is mainly driving the policy making. In order to raise the voice of global south, central banks of the region should come together. They should discuss the issues. We shouldn't be just kind of policy takers. If we do our homework, if you really convey well-grounded, well-researched ideas, it will be taken more seriously. Right now, I cannot say that this is completely uncertain. Some countries are better than the others, but overall, there needs to be more emphasis to be given to climate-related policy discussions and the research, because at the end of the day, this is not just about economics. This is about the international relations. This is about the negotiations. And certainly, central banks examples are quite good because we have similar global regulations in banking, in financial markets, even very early. But even after 2008, there are very good examples and regulations coming about the financial markets regulations, and the Financial Stability Board was the leading institutions. We should be represented in these institutions more, like BIS, in the BIS meetings, in the IMF World Bank meetings. And this is an ongoing effort. It's not like one time attending and then trying to convince the other leaders. The more we prepare and make a more convincing cases, the voices from the south, from the MENA region, will be listened more. And there's a big room to improve that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ahmed. So you've given us a good idea about the different efforts by various groups. We've heard from you and from Malak. I'm curious how these efforts were received by the public and how these natural disasters impact public opinion. So Salma, what can you tell us about public opinion after these events? I know you have some interesting data on Morocco. Please tell us more.
Yeah, so to look specifically at Morocco, because as I said, we were in the field in Morocco about 3 months after the calamitous effects of September's earthquake. One of the things we saw, and my colleague Mohammed Abu Falga has written this in our Morocco country report, which is currently up and available, is that we're seeing a tale of two Moroccos, right? One for the wealthier and better educated, and one for the poorer and less educated. And these kind of these class divides really permeate the opinions on the response, the government response, and ideas on what should happen next. So when we asked about the government's manage of the earthquake crisis, the plurality, 43% said they met expectations, slightly more, 31% say they surpassed rather than failed to meet them. But when we see, specifically when we look at kind of those tail ends, is that those who can't cover their expenses are much less likely to have a positive assessment of how the government handled managing the earthquake. When we ask kind of speaking towards what both Malak and Ahmed had talked about in terms of future rebuilding, future policy making, thinking about services in areas affected by the earthquake, of course, the earthquake itself had shed light on, especially in Morocco, especially in areas in the Atlas Mountains that were already infrastructurally less developed than other areas. It shed light on the fact that these areas really needed or just how badly things were there. And so we're asking about, when we ask about, whether things will improve, stay the same, or worsen, there is optimism. 61% say that they think it will improve. But again, a significant difference between kind of those who are wealthy and those who are not in terms of whether or not we will see that kind of improvement. Those who are not wealthy are likelier to say that the services in those areas are going to stay the same, if not, in fact, worsen. When we, asking about the reverberations of the response to the earthquake, in terms of who did the most, and this kind of speaks to who, the actors that Ahmed had started to speak about, the largest share, say that so we asked about each of these four actors, individual citizens, Moroccan civil society organizations, international humanitarian organizations, and the government. And the first thing to notice is that the majority of Moroccans say that they were very or somewhat effective, each of these. But the highest share, right, so 93% say that it was in fact individual citizens, followed by Moroccan civil society organizations. The lowest one there, though still at 70%, is the government. And what we've seen a little bit, and again, my colleague Mohammed speaks about this in the Morocco report, is that we have seen a bit of an uptick in terms of trust in kind of various government institutions. It's still low, but there is an uptick. The one kind of exception, well, I should say it follows that pattern, but really isn't low, is trust in civil society organizations, where that we really saw this skyrocketing between 48% in 2022 in our Wave 7 data to 70% saying they trust civil society organizations. So, the reverberations definitely have an impact on how people are assessing the institutions that affect them. Speaking as well to kind of points that Malak and Ahmed brought up in terms of the recovery policies, right? So, the immediate aftermath, a very high share of Moroccans, 92% said they wanted part of the national budget allocated to providing relief to victims and compensation specifically for damaged property. But again, it's not about dealing with the immediate aftermath. It's building towards the future. So this doesn't happen again. So 89% are favor passing a new law requiring earthquake resistant building standards, even if that increases building time and costs. And I know that this was also part of the discussion. I'm sure Ahmed can speak more to it in Turkey, in Gaziantep in particular, where a lot of the building in the last couple of years to accommodate increasing pressures there. There were questions on, how sound those buildings were. Then with respect to foreign aid, we asked if people, were favorable towards or unfavorable towards, accepting foreign aid versus refusing foreign aid. Interestingly, only 46% supported the government's refusing foreign aid, and this was a big in the aftermath in Morocco in particular. There was a big conversation about this with respect to France in particular, and expecting and accepting French aid for it. But it seems like people really were crying out for just accepting aid from wherever it could come, because that's how dire the situation has become. And so this, again, like Ahmed had suggested, does have a direct impact on kind of international and bilateral relations. I want to go back to a slide that I kind of spoke about briefly at the beginning about what comes to mind when you hear the term climate change. And I highlighted Morocco initially. So what you'll see here is that we really almost have, it's a 50-50 split in terms of who says extreme weather and who says natural disasters, right? Is that when the thing comes most proximate to you, I mean, that is what people are gonna respond with. And so this has definitely affected people's opinions of challenges facing the country and what to do about it. So yes, those saying that climate change is the biggest challenge facing the country is still small, but it doubles between 6% and 13% in the span of 1 year. Those saying that the national government should be doing more also doubles tremendously from 40% in 2022 to 80% in 2023. That type of seismic shift is very much in response to what had happened with the earthquake. So in summary, while evaluations of the government's response are lukewarm, there is optimism that it has highlighted some of these problems and the government will include services. These kind of findings, though, again, are very much they very much vary according to class. The earthquake appears to have had considerable effects on evaluations of institutions, particularly civil society, which was seen as the champion of relief efforts. And so, the way in which domestic actors begin to respond is very much affected by climate, by these climate issues. And finally, as the effects of climate change become more proximate to citizens' lives, and unfortunately, the more detrimental to them, there is an increasing appetite to have the government take preventative action.
Thank you, Selma. So you've all helped us to understand why natural disasters are increasing, how climate change comes into play, and the impact on our region in several ways, including in terms of public opinion. I think it's important to end with next step and future policies. And I'd like each of you to take 2 minutes and tell us what you think should happen next. Melek, as our climate expert, how would you describe the rate the current climate policies? And how do you think leaders can improve them?
Thank you so much, Yasmina. In terms of climate policies, I mean, for the region as a whole, I would say that the MENA ranks as one of the regions, most vulnerable to climate change due to its high exposure to extreme heat, also water scarcity, urbanization along coastlines, but climate-induced conflicts over water resources, the stress over, let's say, water resources coupled with displacement from natural disaster, it poses, I believe, existential threats to many of the region's fragile states, including Libya. We see from Libya as considered a prime example of a country that's struggling between the dual pressures of political instability, but also environmental vulnerability. And given that the country's lack of effective climate policy has directly tied to its fragmented governance, and as a result, Libya as well, along with the MENA region, ranks poorly in terms of preparedness for climate risks. And here we're not only talking about natural disasters, but climate policies in general and how to tackle the different issues posed by climate change. But if I would say one thing, I think one thing that we learned from the disasters that happened last year is how we can strengthen climate policies in the MENA region. And when we talk about building resilient infrastructure, it should have in mind the community input. There's something that we still have in the MENA region is the top-down approach, which I believe has its fallouts, and that we need, when we address climate issues or environmental issues in general, we need to take into account the community aspect. So ensuring that we have infrastructure projects, for instance, like dams, flood defenses, that are designed with local community input to meet their specific needs. There is this separation, or I would say the divide between the community aspect and climate, let's say strengthening climate policies in the region. And I believe that we need to take into account the bottom-up approach where many of the solutions are driven by the community input in order to ensure that we have community engagement. We bridge the gap between policymakers and between communities on the ground. So it's important for me, if I would focus on one thing, I mean, there are different aspects in terms of regional cooperation, in terms of developing early warning systems and disaster preparedness programs, but I would stress on building resilient climate policies that take into account the community lens and understanding the direct impact of climate change on communities.
Thank you, Malek. Ahmed, I'm thinking again of your brief on earthquake preparedness in Turkey. And in 2 minutes, what can you tell us about next steps?
Thank you, Yasmina. Actually, the Malek has said the key term. Key term is the resilience. We start discussing this resilience more, especially with COVID-19 crisis. But the terms apparently will remain with us. And we have to be future ready, future readiness, resilience. This sort of concept started to be much more important because probably we are feeling this uncertainty more. It is the global age of global anxieties due to increasing uncertainties. It might not be just about we want to control everything as modern individuals, but also empirically we see that there are changes. Climate change is there. There are much more natural disasters. So at the country level, we have to prepare for this. But we know that especially in developing countries, there are lots of governance related issues. And it is not easy to make like medium to long-term plans. So we cannot just leave it to the developing countries. And especially this is important when we discuss the climate change related measures. Like I consider that with climate change related discussions, we are trying to insure the world, right? I mean, something happening, and probably it is something that each and every country might be affected at different times. So by engaging in the climate change related regulations, we are trying to ensure ourselves there will be less the increase in the climate temperature, and all the countries, all the people will be positively affected. But when it comes to the costs, or when it comes to climate change related disasters, it is affecting the countries at different times. So we need kind of a global insurance. And in this global insurance, there could be taxation and so on, but where is this money going to be used? One of the things, in addition to the national policies, there should be some sort of a disaster fund, a climate change related disaster fund, where today it is Libya or Sudan or Yemen or Turkey. Whenever there is a climate change related disasters, the countries should be supported internationally, because these disasters cannot be easy to be handled with the national resources. The countries should be very precautious, should be taking the actions very early, which is difficult for these countries because they are, by definition, developing countries. So my suggestion is that, I mean, we have international institutions like the World Bank, IMF, but they are not really designed for this. Or even BRICS, right? There is all this discussion about BRICS establishing bank. But I don't. I believe that somebody should push for the idea that we should have a climate change related disasters fund whenever there's a disaster comes, because this is not the mistake of the countries. You know, in the IMF World Bank case, they come when you have a mistake, right? It's first generation crisis model, second generation crisis model. You are in fault, and then they come to help you, or they try to impose certain conditions to give funding. But in the disaster cases associated with the climate change, the countries do not necessarily have a big mistake. I mean, certainly they have issues about the not maintaining the dam right and so on, but this is not completely in their policy space. So that's why this will be kind of an insurance. I mean, and this will include the global south more, because right now what the global north is saying, okay, the climate is changing, and then you should contribute, you should pay more cost. But what is the return for me? I mean, many of the global south countries are saying that in the past you colonized the world, you pollute the environment, but now we are paying the cost together. That's why global north even should push for this idea. There should be a climate change related disaster fund, and this should be given to the countries to mitigate the problems when the disasters come. And this is one of the solution, I believe. And I propose a similar thing for Turkey somewhat after the earthquake. But this will make the developing countries to feel more ownership, because right now, again, we are selling insurance, or we are saying that we have to save the world, climate change, and so on. But we don't tell the countries what will be the benefit for them. And the benefit for them could be to benefit from this climate change related disaster fund. And there could be a separate entity, or Islamic Development Bank, World Bank, some of the international organizations can be more involved in this establishing the funds. Thank you.
Thank you, Ahmed. I think also the Arab League has been discussing doing something collaboratively, so that would be something for them to consider as well. So we got the expert advice on what to do next. Selma, what do MENA citizens think about next steps for climate change, about who causes the problem and who's responsible for the solution? What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so this is one of the main things that we really were talking about, especially in the wake of COP27, where a big part of the discussion centered around this idea of the people or the countries with the largest carbon footprint are not necessarily in the MENA region, and yet the MENA region is one of the ones feeling the biggest impacts, right? And so I want to talk about attribution from two perspectives. The first was going back to our shared understanding of what climate change is. Again, just around half or more do talk about temperatures, but when we actually ask about the extent to which citizens from your country contribute to a great or medium extent to climate change, those percentages, they are still majorities, but they're slight majorities. And in fact, in 3 countries, in Palestine, Mauritania, and Kuwait, it's actually less than half that believe that citizens themselves actually contribute to climate change. So that's something that would need to be addressed. But more importantly, that across the board, so I'll show kind of three bits of data on, citizens from your country versus citizens from Western countries. In general, MENA citizens believe that regardless of whether these people contribute to climate change, they are nonetheless responsible for addressing climate change. And those differentials are actually quite large. For example, in Morocco, while only 55% believe that citizens from their country contribute to climate change, 67% believe that citizens should actually be responsible for addressing climate change. And that actually doesn't change tremendously between citizens from your country versus citizens from the West. There is a little bit, the differentials are a little bit bigger, but in general, with respect to citizens, again, with respect to private businesses, more people say private businesses than citizens are actually responsible for contributing to climate change. But again, also see that the responsibility for addressing climate change among those businesses is quite high, whether they be businesses in your country or from your country, or businesses in Western countries. The largest differentials we see is with the government, right? So while in Morocco, Kuwait, Lebanon, Iraq, so across the board, half or more of citizens believe that the government is contributing to climate change, but very, very large proportions, from 71% in Palestine to 93% in Kuwait, says the government should be responsible for addressing climate change. And we see similar patterns for Western governments as well. And over time, we've really seen that people do want the national government to be doing more about climate change across the board, right? With the exception of Palestine and in Jordan, more than half of citizens think governments should be doing more. In Jordan, 48% more versus 33% say that they actually should be doing about the same, thinking that the government is trying to kind of tackle some of these issues, particularly as it pertains to water scarcity, which is a huge issue for Jordan. In terms of what measures should be taken, again, these come right out of the COP27 kind of recommendations. So there is appetite for phasing out fossil fuel production, except for in Kuwait, and there is appetite for slowly phasing out fossil fuel use in exchange for a huge, very strong support. Over 80% of citizens in every single surveyed country say that they strongly or somewhat favor the government prioritizing alternative energy development. They want to see this happen. They also, over 60%, say they strongly or somewhat favor setting a target date for phasing out car pollution. So what this means is that, while it's still only half of citizens in surveyed countries that recognize that human action is what contributes to climate change, so there's still work to be done to raise more awareness in that regard. That said, citizens in MENA already recognize that even if they themselves, their governments or private enterprise are not the ones causing climate change, it's incumbent upon them to be part of the solution, right? And they see that particularly as a responsibility of their governments. Excuse me. Citizens are open to multiple avenues of kind of course correction. Moves to alternative energy production are not seen as a zero-sum game with decreasing but not discontinuing the use of fossil fuel. So there's a little bit of push and pull there, that it's not going to change all at once. And finally, as we saw in the beginning, climate change might not be the most pressing of all problems confronting the region, and there are many of those right now. But citizens nonetheless recognize it as a threat, and the vast majority of citizens want their governments to be doing more to address the problem.
Thank you, Selma, Ahmed, Malak. We've had a very rich discussion, and I'm sure we're going to have a richer Q&A session because we've received over a dozen questions. The first round of these questions concerns climate change. And Malak, I'm going to start with you on this one. Are there innovative approaches or technologies being explored to mitigate the impact of natural disasters in the region? And how can these solutions be scaled or adapted to fit different national contexts?
Thank you so much, Ismina, for the question. I mean, in terms of, if I understood correctly, is it linked to how the region responds to the multiple disasters or the initiatives? Can you repeat the question, please?
Oh, sorry. So the question is, are there innovative approaches or technologies being explored to mitigate the impact of natural disasters? And how can these be scaled up? So I think on the end of...
So in terms of technologies, in order to tackle natural disasters, I mean, the main question here, if we're talking about it, is the data sharing aspect and monitoring. One of the key aspects that are crucial to tackle natural disasters is linked to real-time data collection, availability, and also monitoring of natural disasters. The region as a whole, I mean, in different countries, they have somewhat the capacities in order to monitor certain natural disasters. If we talk about Storm Daniel, it's something that it was accessible and easy to monitor by different governments and also by the public. I mean, I myself was able to track how the storm was moving with real-time monitoring using satellite imagery. So it's something, if we talk about the technologies, we have to an extent the technologies, but I would say that it differs from one country to another in terms of outdated technologies or innovations. It's something I believe that we need to push forward for in terms of not demanding, but I think having or using the efficient funds in order to update the available technologies in order to monitor natural disasters. I mean, this is the question of finance, how countries in the MENA region can effectively update the existing technologies that they're using and effectively apply real-time monitoring techniques. So in brief, I would say that countries have, to an extent, the capacities in terms of monitoring of natural disasters, but it's the question of up-to-date technologies. And this is the question here on how different countries can leverage their internal capacities, but also their regional capacities in order to update the available technologies.
Thank you, Malak. The next question is for Ahmed. This is from someone who'd like to share that they are a Moroccan citizen and that they feel that the presentations by you, Ahmed, by Malak, and by Salma were rooted in reality. And the question is, how do we increase the percentage of services and support to the affected areas around the world?
Thank you, Yasmina. I believe that this is, as I mentioned, this cannot be done at the national level. Certainly, the countries will get ready, will increase their resilience for this sort of shocks, but there should be a coordinated international efforts, and this will increase the legitimacy of the international order. There are lots of discussions about the declining legitimacy of the UN, declining legitimacy of IMF, World Bank, and so on. There has to be some sort of global coordination because most of these disasters are not necessarily easy for national countries to handle. One thing, for example, it is also related with the first question. In the MENA countries, we do probably a lot in terms of helping the countries when they have some disasters, when they have some issues. But this is not institutionalized. I mean, something happens, the countries are helping each other. But if it is a fund that we know that if a natural disaster comes, we can easily unleash the money because even the coordination just after the disasters is a big problem. But when we know that the funds are already available there, we can have quickly and more timely actions at the more global level. And also, this sort of funds are also enable the countries to coordinate. And one of the questions was about how the Arab countries are coordinating. I mean, if you just want to coordinate on the policy dimensions, on all issues, you will not be able to coordinate. But this is related with the humanitarian aid. This is related with the most difficult times. And the Muslim countries are relatively even more inclined to do this sort of things. And I believe this sort of collaboration among the Muslim countries, among the Arab countries, among the MENA countries, to establish such a fund and then to help the countries when they have natural disasters will also open up avenues for further collaborations on climate change, further collaborations on discussing with the global north. We oftentimes think that we have to just, the leaders will come together and they will decide. But this kind of institutionalization of coordination, this is what happened with BIS sort of institutions, right? It is not necessarily all the time the leaders come together. Instead, the policymakers come together and they decide. I believe we need this sort of policy coordination even more with the climate change, with these disasters in our region. I believe this will be even helpful for the peacemaking in the region. Because if you settle the issues one by one, when you have some mechanisms at least to help in difficult times, it will also help to mitigate the other problems in the long run. Thank you.
Thank you, Ahmed. Thank you. Our next question is for Salma. Salma, we have a question about what did you notice were the biggest changes in attitudes I think they meant before and after the natural disasters.
Yeah, thank you. Like I mentioned, so the ones in Morocco were kind of the clearest uh, demonstration of that in terms of people recognizing just how acute the problem is. It is not just it's not a philosophical debate anymore. It is real. It has direct impact on people's lives. And, I think it is difficult because climate change is one of many problems that is facing the region right now. There's certainly no shortage of problems, and so I think with so many, it's difficult for people to assign priorities to them. But unfortunately, what is happening is the more kind of these natural disasters happen, the more it's raising awareness in the public conscious of just how calamitous their effects are. That is having the impact of having people demand more from their governments, and is time will tell a little bit as we start to kind of track this over time. But in the two markers where we have tracked over time, both, for example, the extent to which climate change is the biggest problem and the extent to which the government should be doing more, Morocco provided a very clear example of how on both of those measures, we saw drastic changes in people's opinions. They want the government to do more, that a bigger share of them recognizes just how problematic climate change is. And moving forward, as both Ahmed and Malek said, I think part of it is, yes, this fund of kind of preventative, what happens when the calamity strikes. But I think the other part of the discussion, which, we also started to talk about, is how do we start preventing the disasters from happening to begin with, right? How do we start lessening our carbon footprint? So that part of that is really in some of the oil producing states, moving to alternative energy sources, doing more with recycling programs, etc.
Thank you, Selma. Thank you to all our three speakers for this illuminating discussion. I learned a lot, and I trust that our audience members did as well. Now, to our audience members, I know we didn't get a chance to answer all your questions. For those of you who would like to read more on this topic, please note that the Middle East Council on Global Affairs has published several briefs tackling climate change and natural disasters. I can recommend the following ones, and my colleague will put these in the chat now. There's a brief on tackling climate policy uncertainty in MENA by Tariq Youssef, Ahmed Aysan, and Oguzhan Sepni. There's a brief by Ali bin Musa on division and disaster, Libya's political fragmentation and response to the Derna floods. And there's a brief on global finance reintegration, key to Turkey's earthquake recovery by Ahmed Aysan. Thank you all for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you again at our next event, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Yasmina.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you very much.
you,
Thank you.
Ahmed. Thank you, Selma. Thank you,
Thank
Malek.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Malek. Thank you, Salma. Thank you, Susan.
Thanks
Thank
to
you.
the interpreters or the translators.
Yes, thank you, Hasna. Thank you, Zaki.
Thank you so much.